Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lecture of Level 4 of Introduction to Games for Learning. In this level, Playa de Players, we will be looking at various ways that players are represented in games, both self-representation of how players project themselves into the magic circle of a game, and also how game designers conceptualize and model and represent the players of their intended audience, which is what the subject of this lecture is, heroes and heuristics, representing archetypes in design. So let's get right into it. First, I might just want to define what I mean when I use the word heuristic, because it can have a couple of different definitions depending on where you are, but we're coming at this from a design perspective. So a heuristic is a working model, rule of thumb, or a simple conjecture used to guide the design process. So heuristic is basically like a rule or a statement about some aspect of the design that you can use as just kind of a benchmark to check how the design is functioning in some specific way. Heuristics can be evidence-based, or rather, they can be based in evidence-based theories. You can derive heuristics from more widely used models like stages of development. A useful design heuristic is the core needs of SDT, self-determination theory. Now, what that doesn't mean is that the designer is going to do like rigorous psychological research to determine whether and how those core needs are being met within the design. That's not what it is, but it's taking the shorthand version of that more complicated evidence-based theory and boiling it down into a useful rule of thumb, which is to check for, am I addressing competence and how? Am I addressing relatedness and how? Am I addressing autonomy and how? And if you come back from one of those questions with a difficult answer, then that's a sign to adjust your design and then keep moving forward and keep iterating. So anyway, heuristics can certainly be based in established frameworks. Just as easily, though, you can develop your own using just a case study or a grounded theory approach where you just try to describe what you are seeing in a particular design context, and kind of take whatever the initial prototype gives you and then work with that and try to refine that as you go. So all a heuristic really is just a useful rule of thumb or step in the design process to help guide you and keep you focused on the really important aspects of whatever it is you're working on. Now, one type of heuristic is archetypes. This is what I would say all archetypes are a form of heuristics, but certainly heuristics can be other things besides archetypes. But an archetype heuristic is when you have a typical or ideal example of something that you were trying to capture, or a recurring pattern, or a classification system where you try to take like all of a certain set of things, let's say players, because that's what we're talking about, and you try to develop a system where you can classify and organize any given individual from a set and put it into one of your categories so that you can kind of approach it in a useful way, if a simplified way, but just to help you conceptualize and keep yourself organized on that level. So the two models of gamer types that we're going to be discussing in this lecture, in this first part of level 4, these are both heuristic models, which is to say they are working models designed to describe a particular type of environment, in this case, online multiplayer games. They're not making broader claims than that and should not be overinterpreted. But what is useful is that these two models were developed in interestingly different ways. And so this kind of gives us a way to look at the process of developing useful models and useful um, design frameworks for yourself as you go about your own process of designing to improve instruction and learning. So the two types, if you haven't already gone through the rest of the readings, I would recommend doing that first. The two we're discussing here are Richard Bartle's theory of player types, also known as Bartle's taxonomy, and then Nick Yee's gamer motivation profiles, which are a little more recent, in many ways, inspired by Bartle's work, Bartle's earlier work, but take, as I said, an interestingly different approach to building those archetypes. And it's useful to see the differences between these two thinkers and how they arrived at their design heuristics. So let's start with Bartle's taxonomy, or the theory of player types more formally. Bartle was the co-developer of Mud 1 and then later Mud 2, which were the original multi-user dungeons. These were text-based games, but they were kind of the very first um, multiplayer online role-playing games. And in the course of many years of developing and then observing these game ecosystems, Bartle developed this theory of that there were four main types of players. And he classified them as killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers, as you can see in the chart here. And this observation was based, as I said, on direct, kind of almost an ethnographic observation of the game itself, and also interviews and conversations with other longtime, highly active members of this gaming community. And these are the four archetypes that kind of emerged out of that process of observation. And then once he had those four archetypal models, these four categories that players could be sorted into, um, at that point, the second step of the model was to try to derive the underlying features of the game and the underlying behaviors that were being observed that would explain how these types related to each other and what made the difference between how an individual player would get classed into one or the other. And what he arrived at were these two axes of being either focused on the game world itself or oriented more towards the community of other players within the game world. And then the vertical axis of acting, which is goal-directed behavior, versus interacting, which is more open-ended, exploratory behavior without necessarily being aimed at a specific concrete outcome. And what is kind of interesting is that if you think in terms of the mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics framework, which of course we are going to do because that's what we do in this class, um, I would say that what Bartle did is started out at the dynamic level. He was describing observable patterns of behaviors and interactions within the game's player community. So that's the dynamics, like the observable events and interactions that go on. So he started at the dynamic level and then he worked to derive the underlying aesthetics that were driving those different manifestations of dynamics. And then from there, he was able to take that framework, this Bartle's taxonomy, and use it and apply it to develop better game mechanics in future games. You know, he's a legendary consultant in the online multiplayer gaming space at this point. You know, he's worked on many, many other games since Mud and Mud 2. But he to consult on and get at the mechanics and help improve the design of these games. He started from the dynamic level, derived what the overarching aesthetics that led to these specific manifestations of dynamics were, and then use all of that together to kind of get at, well, what mechanics will appeal to specific player types and in the way that they either contribute to the game world or contribute to the social interaction possibilities of the game space, and in the ways that they create goal-oriented acting behaviors, or in the ways that they can support more open-ended interacting behaviors. One other aspect of Bartle's taxonomy that isn't really present in the original article that you read, but is present in his more fleshed out book length treatment from which is called Designing Virtual Worlds. It's a fascinating read. It's very long, which is why I did not assign it. But he also observed that players who were new to a game, who were entering a new game environment for the first time, often, not always, but often would go through what he called the main sequence, where they would kind of behave in accordance with each of the player types in succession, before ultimately settling into a pattern that fit their overall individual vibe or dynamic. Uh, if they stuck around in a game long enough to begin expressing themselves in that way. And the main sequence was killer to explorer to achiever to socializer. So you sort of start out a little bit directionless and violent, and then become um, a little more invested in the game and pursuing the actual goals of the game, and then becoming more invested in the community itself, and ultimately arriving at socializer, where the game is not just a thing that you do, a thing that you play for yourself, but is a community that you belong to. So we're going to come back to this in a second, this main sequence, because I think that it speaks to something interesting about Bartle's design method of starting again from the dynamics first, figuring those out from observation, and then working to interpret the overarching aesthetics from that. So we will return to this in a few minutes, but I want to move on to the second design example from this level, which is Nick Yee's gamer motivation profiles that he developed out of his PhD research, which was in psychology, and he was specifically looking at the psychology of online gamers. And what he did is he started kind of from a different direction from Bartle. He went all the way to the aesthetic end first, and he conducted a lot of surveys of people who played all manner of different video games and computer games online. And he was specifically interested in seeing what appealed to them, what kinds of aesthetic experiences motivated and appealed to different gamers. And what came out of that was this model of these 6 overarching aesthetic motivations that individuals can find appealing in a game or not, as the case may be. And so the 6 big ones are action, social, mastery, achievement, immersion, and creativity. This top line on the diagram you've seen here. And then below that, you did some fancy statistics that are frankly like a little bit beyond even me. Um, but he was able to sort of break each of those down into a couple of different sub aesthetics as well. And then also at the other end, kind of observed that the six motivations tend to cluster together into these three trios more often than not, which are action social, mastery achievement, and immersion creativity. And so while they can and do vary independently from each other, and um, the fact that you are, for example, a highly social gamer, if someone scores highly social on the survey, does not necessarily mean that they will also be highly action oriented, but it's a little more likely. They do correlate somewhat with each other, but then the three clusters really don't correspond at all, and that's what's really fascinating. So action social do correlate to some extent, not in all cases, certainly not for all individuals, but statistically in an overall population of gamers, yes, they do correlate to some extent. But if you have a high-ish action social score, that really doesn't predict at all what your immersion creativity score will be. Could be high, could be low. Individuals vary. Um, and so that's what's really interesting about these findings is that you've got these three kind of high level clusters that may or may not correlate with each other in any individual case. And then you can decompose them down into the six major axes of the model or the 12 subscores as well, depending on the level of fine-grained analysis that you as a game developer paying Nikki to come in and be your consultant on your player base, um, depending on the level of detail you're looking for in that process. So Yi started at the aesthetic level and then used that data to, through statistical clustering analysis, to identify these 9 archetypes. So these are the dynamics in this model, these 9 archetypes of motivations and styles of play or behaviors that tend to crop up again and again. So certain repeating patterns. Remember, one of the definitions of archetype is a repeating pattern or motif. So certain repeating patterns that appear in terms of a particular balance of these 6 core motivations that were identified at the aesthetic level. I'm not really going to get too deep into these because there's 9 of them. There's frankly too many to discuss. You can take the Quantic Foundry gamer profile survey for yourself, and you will get one or possibly 2 of these, like a main and a sub archetype, and discuss it in the class discussion boards. Highly encourage you to do that. I think every year people find that it tends to feel like it's a pretty accurate reflection of themselves. Not in all cases, so I encourage you to check that out for yourself. And so what I want to highlight here, though, to get back to the actual topic, is that these two models kind of start in work in opposite directions a little bit. Ultimately, both of them are aiming at um, creating usable heuristics for game developers to look at their audience and understand what kind of tweaks can we make to the mechanics of the game that will either support dynamics and aesthetics that we want, that we see are valuable and make a positive contribution to our player base and make people want to play our game. And also on the flip side, what can we do at the mechanical level to disincentivize antisocial behavior, like not appeal to the kinds of behaviors we don't want to see. And or, if they have a more narrow conception of their audience, most games are not going to try to appeal to all 9 of these Quantic Foundry gamer motivation types. Um, who is our core audience? How do we appeal to them? And what are the things we don't need to bother doing? Like if we're trying to appeal to very action and competition oriented audience, we probably don't need, what kinds of social tools do we need that will appeal to them, and what kinds of social tools do we just not need to bother with in our game? Um, so starting from these two different directions, you can see how they both arrive at interestingly similar places on one level and very different places on another level. And I think one thing that emerges from this picture is um, how we tie it back to more broad-based theories. Again, these are heuristic models. Neither Bartle nor Yee is trying to make any broader claims about um, human behavior. They are strictly looking at how people interact and like how you attract and maintain a player base in an online multiplayer game. Bartle in particular is like famously opposed to anyone trying to expand or apply his four-part taxonomy in other areas. It's strictly for online games with fantasy elements and both competition and cooperation aspects to the overall gameplay. But having said that, I'm now going to do exactly the thing Richard Bartle does not want me to do, because starting at the aesthetic level, back to Yee for a second, I think that it is worth observing that the way he, he's trying to look at the deeper underlying uh, needs and drives of a gamer population. And what he kind of seems to have reverse engineered in his specific context of study is the core needs of self-determination theory, intrinsic motivation, of relatedness, competence, and autonomy. Action social maps onto relatedness, both in terms of interaction, whether that's cooperation or respectful competition, and also the action component relates to like excitable anecdotes or share-worthy experiences, wanting to be able to, um, if any of you played games when you yourselves were still in school, you might have that memory of like at the lunch table being able to tell a cool story about something awesome you did in Gears of War the night before or Halo. Um, I was never able to participate in that because my lifetime Halo kill count is negative because I was really bad at it and I fell off of things and died. And in a couple of the Halo titles, if you died, if you caused your own death, it counted as negative, not just as a zero. Mastery achievement, obviously. Speaking of the exact opposite of what I was just talking about, maps onto competence, and then immersion creativity appears to map onto autonomy. Do I think Nikki set out to do this? No. Do I think he is familiar with self-determination theory? Yes. He is an actual honest-to-God psychology PhD. It would be very weird if he hadn't done his reading, and he clearly has done his reading. So, to some extent, I think that that framework is present underneath all this work he did, and that is really cool. That you can, again, as I said before, you can have these heuristic design models. They can certainly be rooted in a wider, more universal framework, and you're just kind of creating your shorthand version of that to use as a design tool in your specific context. Or you can kind of build something custom for your context and not necessarily need to tie it to any wider claims about the human condition. But even if you do that, you might find yourself winding back up there anyway, which can certainly be its own kind of insight and useful feedback on a design. So to go back to Bartle then, remember, Yee started at the aesthetic level and kind of seems to have reverse engineered this underlying theory of intrinsic motivation, which is very much bound up in aesthetics and sort of overarching drives. Bartle began at the dynamic level, and that's where I think his most valuable contribution is, that he was doing this kind of close ethnographic observation of a real community, a real virtual community. You know what I mean. So, what I believe, my interpretation, and again, Bartle would fiercely resist me doing this, um, is that his main sequence, what he describes as when a player is brand new to a game and kind of still figuring it out and getting acclimated, they go through over the course of those early weeks or maybe early months of getting into a new multiplayer game. They go through this sequence of killer, explorer, achiever, socializer. I believe that what Bartle accidentally reverse engineered is the self-determination theory model of regulatory styles, which you might remember from the readings back in level 2, um, which describe how the balance between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and how those are integrated with each other or not, as in individual cases. And so the killer, I think, is an example of external regulation. Now, external regulation doesn't mean that you lack intrinsic motivations. That's never the case. Like, we always are subject to both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations in all situations. What external regulation means, though, is that they're not synced up with each other. And so someone at that level of regulation is going to engage with the system to the minimum amount that they absolutely have to. Like any unavoidable rules, they will engage with, but beyond that kind of minimal, like anything that they can be forced to do, their intrinsic goals and their behavior are not going to be in alignment with the context around them. And so, in a multiplayer fantasy game with combat and competition elements, that's going to manifest itself as killer behavior, as troll or griefer behavior, where you just try to aggravate the other players around you and just provoke a reaction. In the classroom, that will maybe manifest. It certainly can manifest as the same kind of disruptive behavior, bullying behavior, but it can manifest in other ways too, in a student who is disengaged except to the minimum level. You know, they can be forced to physically attend class because truant officers are a thing and there's a legal framework for that. But beyond that, once they are physically in the classroom, um, a student who is externally regulated just means that their intrinsic motivation is not at all in alignment with any of the extrinsic factors of the curriculum or the classroom around them. And then as we go through, explorers begin looking to create some of their own goals, not necessarily the ones that were intended, but they begin that process, that introjected process of at least like looking for something they can hang on to, something that can kind of line up with their own intrinsic needs. Achievers actually have begun to properly internalize the goals of the system around them and like go chasing those and trying to prove their competence and their mastery over that. And then eventually socializers get to the integrated level where um, not only have they internalized the extrinsic goals of the context they find themselves in, but they've actually become a part of a community, and it's not just the game itself, or it's not just the school environment itself, but they've become that's just like the foundation for being a member of a community um, all together. So, like I said, Richard Bartle would have a huge problem with everything I just said in the last 5 minutes. And these are, as it says in the title of the lecture, these are heuristics. They should not be over-interpreted. But what I wanted to talk about was how Bartle and Yee take different approaches to addressing the same underlying problem, but they start at different levels of the MDA framework. They have different design approaches to developing these heuristic models. And then they arrive at interestingly different places where Yee has kind of recreated a version of the core needs aspect of self-determination theory. And Bartle has reverse engineered what I believe is a version of regulatory styles and a better description of different qualities of individual behavior in a given context. And so when you are doing your own design work in your own classrooms, whether it is gamified or not, these are useful approaches to bear in mind. Um, so when you think about the students in your classroom that you see every day or every week if you're on one of those weird odd even day 6-day rotation things that my school district is on. I can't keep track of whether my daughter needs to wear gym shoes or not. I have no idea on any given day. Um, where are you starting from? First of all, are you going to go the Bartle route and try to base your thinking in direct observations of your actual students? Are you going the Yee route and you're trying to think in terms of those larger goals or needs of a design, um, and kind of filter your way down to the more concrete individual level from there? Um, and it should be said that mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, I use it a lot, but it's certainly not the only way to start thinking about this. You might not find it a useful, MDA itself is a design heuristic, and you might not find it useful for your particular context or particular project. Um, but think about where you are starting from. What are your core heuristics that are going to really kind of shape the nature of the project and the nature of the information that you're going to try to gather in order to shape your design. Um, Similarly, are you going to use an established framework at all? Fixed versus growth mindset, um, cognitive learning styles, uh, Gardner's multiple intelligences theory, Bloom's taxonomy. These are all design heuristics. Some of them are also based in like real proper science. Some of them are not. Um, I hate to tell you this, but the evidence for sensory learning styles is just, it's not there. I'm sorry. But it's still a useful design heuristic to think about how to present information in multiple different ways that will hopefully engage different students who have diverse needs. So it's still useful in that context. It's a good design tool. Just don't oversubscribe to it and try to filter everything through that lens because it, it's not always going to work. Um, and then as we also saw in the two examples in this lecture, there are you can kind of start out at one layer and be trying to describe one thing, and then that sort of leads you to asking further questions. And Bartle starts out at the concrete level of like, here are my players, and then tried to figure out why they were acting that way, um, and develop this secondary layer. And actually, if you go and pick up a copy of Designing Virtual Worlds, which again I reiterate is huge and not recommended unless you're very, very serious about game design. But if you happen to stumble across it, he actually expands this further. He adds a third axis, so it goes from 4 player types to 8. And then the main sequence gets much more complicated, and he talks about the ecosystem of how these different player types interact and like how if you increase the population of killers, what does that do to all of the other types? And how they kind of feed back into each other. And so as you go, you're going to kind of develop new layers or new facets to any design model that proves itself useful to you. And so that's a question too. How many layers do you need for a particular project? How do they interrelate? At what point do you need to kind of pull back and focus just on the core of what you started with? Or alternatively, like when do you trim away something that you've been using but you've kind of outgrown because your model has gotten more complex and nuanced, and you just kind of need to drop the more simplified layers. So um, I hope that that is a little bit helpful in you thinking about some of your own design process. This is just one example of how to conceptualize and um, approach the question of who am I designing for? Who is my audience? And then once you have an initial idea for that, a usable working heuristic, then you build it, you start deploying it, you see what happens, you take that information and you feedback and you iterate, and you refine both your working design and your mental heuristic models of what is actually going on and what you're trying to achieve. And then you just do that for 35, 40 years, and then that's a career. And hopefully, you have done something at the end that you can feel good about. So that is all I have to say for right now. I'm sure you're very relieved. Uh, if you have any questions, comments, anything, please post them in the level 4 discussions, and I will talk to you all again soon.